So, good afternoon to those who are already here. We're not really pressed for time, but I don't want to fall too far behind schedule either. They're going to throw us out at 6, or as I told Bob, they're going to hire a security guard if we want to continue, and they'll just make us pay for it. So we have an incentive to be done by 6. This afternoon's proceedings include one talk about film. We cover film extensively in the film and lecture series, but there the focus is on the Cinema Marginal, and this afternoon Daniel Fairfax will tell us something about Glauber Rocha in '68. Then we'll have the concluding keynote by Robert Stam, and then we'll have a final panel discussion moderated by Mark Siegel. And in the spirit of Tropicalia, which has always been a sort of a collective enterprise, we will have a small collective of speakers starting off the final panel discussion, which will include Lina Bader, Laura Teixeira, Moacir Dos Anjos, and Chris Dunn. But we'll very quickly open to the floor, and it will basically be a collective resume of all the conference participants. Let me introduce our first speaker this afternoon. Daniel Fairfax is a film scholar, film critic, film historian and theorist, and a historian of film theory. He just finished a 2-volume study of the Cahiers du Cinéma after 1968. The Red Years, is it going to be called? It's going to be out in a 2-volume edition from Amsterdam University Press sometime next year. And I'm happy to say Danny's current affiliation is actually the Goethe-universität Frankfurt, which he has joined in April, coming from Yale, and he's now working as a postdoc at our university. Please, Danny, come on.
Okay, well, I just want to start off by relaying how privileged I feel to be a part of this event. I think it's been a really fantastic couple of days, and we'll be crowned off in even better fashion by Robert Stam's keynote, I trust. I particularly want to thank, obviously, Vinzenz and Laura and others for organizing it, but it seems like he didn't make it back from lunch, but Max, I just want to highlight his talk from yesterday, which I found incredibly stimulating, and also I think, hopefully as we'll see, enters into a certain dialogue with what I'm about to say, not only because there are definitely distinct parallels between the evolution of Glauber Rocha's work and that of Elio Witisica, as Max outlined last night, this kind of the moment of exile and the kind of difficulties or problems that created for the reception of his work. The same kind of phenomenon happens with Glauber Rocha, but also because the film that I will mainly be talking about today, Cancer, from 1968, actually is also a site of encounter between Rocha and Witisica. So Elio Witisica has a kind of pretty significant role in the film, certainly significant. If not, I mean, he's not in the film to a large extent, but I think the moments he appears are very important moments. So I'll do this little thing. So I want to argue, and this is kind of, this isn't kind of departing from standard accounts of Glauber Rocha's filmography by any means, that his work divides into 2 reasonably distinct phases. The first being in the 1960s, from the early 60s up until 1969, which I would call the kind of national popular phase. It's obviously a term of very Gramscian overtones. This was a period where he made his most well-known films. Black God, White Devil, Terra, Transe, Antonio dos Montes. These are now part of the kind of canon of modernist cinema or 60s cinema on a global level. These films won over both national and international critics. and they still, at the time, but they still form the focus of most scholarship on Glauber Rocha, and kind of dominate the reception of Rocha as a filmmaker. They represented, to a certain degree, a genuine attempt to reach a mass audience, certainly in Brazil. And during this period, Glauber Rocha had, in a certain way, a kind of commercial mindset, which is not to say that he was kind of crassly, kind of financial in orientation, but he wanted to build up a kind of alternative pole in the Brazilian film industry, together with other filmmakers in the Cinema Novo. He spoke about kind of, we need to be making hundreds of films and reaching every corner of Brazil with these works, and kind of, as a kind of part of a political and cultural almost renaissance in Brazil, as part of a kind of, let's say, broader third world awakening. This is not to say that these films are not, a kind of... we've got the kids again. This is not to say that these films, that we would recognize them as commercial films, that they're definitely replete with kind of new and experimental aesthetic practices. But in general, there is an attempt, at least, to link this formal experimentation into traditions of Brazilian folk culture. And so when he talks about things, in his various manifestos of cinema of hunger, cinema of violence, aesthetics of dreams, and so on and so forth, tricontinentalism, this informs this kind of this period of his work. He also saw himself as kind of really aligned with and an integral part of, and kind of in the end becoming almost too dominant within a broader aesthetic and political movement, the Cinema Novo, but then also part of an artistic wave more generally, as we've talked about in the 1960s, and that this conference is focusing on. And in his public interventions, the general kind of mode of address, I guess, is a we. He's speaking in the first person plural. We are doing this. We, the Cinema Novo. We, the kind of new filmmakers in Brazil, want to do this, are trying to do this, are trying to achieve this. This is a manifesto-like voice. Artistic manifestos are always written in the we, right? In the plural. They're not written in the singular. This, however, comes to an end in this moment, 1968 to 1969, and we move on to what I would call his cinema of exile phase in the 1970s, which essentially leads up to his death in 1981. He was in geographic exile from 1969 to 1976. He had to leave Brazil, as many other artists did, with the kind of hardening of the military dictatorship and a genuine risk to his own, let's say, physical safety. He spent time in and made films in Congo, Spain, Italy, Cuba, and France, and these include Cabeças Cortadas, De Leone had Sete Cabeças, Historia do Brasil, Claro, de Glauber, and finally A Idade da Terra. In these films, however, there's kind of an increasing absence of any kind of perspective of reaching a mass audience. Now, of course, this is definitely politically overdetermined. Hardening of a censorship regime made it more difficult to do so, but also is part of his own, I would argue, aesthetic evolution. His filmmaking became more formally hermetic and personalized. We start seeing in his films the kind of dominance of the persona of Glauber Rocha himself. His voice starts becoming very present in these films, very noticeably. And but I would also argue he's not only kind of in geographic exile, but also he kind of becomes in cultural exile, not only from the Brazilian nation, but also from these cultural movements that he was previously closely tied to. So the we here is being progressively replaced by the I. He's kind of making a film, doing filmmaking that more closely relates only to himself and not to any kind of broader cinematic or artistic movement. These films also marked a period where he essentially lost the favor of most of the critics, or certainly a large number of the critics who had supported his work in the 1960s, and I would say it's still a relatively neglected period in his oeuvre, certainly in comparison to the earlier films. I would also argue, however, and this is where I guess my argument is aligned with that of Max, last night with reference to Elio Oiticica, that this is the period where actually the formal possibilities of the cinema were pushed to their very limits, and that actually makes this period of his filmmaking, I don't want to kind of counterpose them too strongly, but in some ways more interesting than the 1960s work, or definitely at least as interesting as the 1960s work. I've talked about, and I think they do merit a very vigorous defense. I would also argue. Now, I would argue that the cinema of exile in Rocha's oeuvre continues right up until his death, even though he comes back to Brazil in 1976. But in some sense, even after returning to Brazil, he remains in exile, certainly from the cultural milieu to which he belonged, partly because, ironically, he actually kind of reconciled with the military dictatorship and kind of very vocally came out in favor of them and saying, we need to support the dictatorship's kind of move towards a more liberal kind of orientation. And this kind of earned him the enduring enmity of a lot of his previous close allies and friends. This is also a period, not to go too deeply into it, in which his life was marked by certain personal tragedies, the death of kind of family members and so on and so forth, that may also have had an effect on his personal relationships. But that's definitely reflected in films such as Die Glauber and Idade de Terra. To go back, though, to this kind of period, 68, 69, in his work, of course, it was represented, if we can just slide back to Antonio das Mortes, in particular, filmed in 1968, but released in 1969, and in many ways, even though it's the end point of the national popular phase, it's also the kind of apotheosis of this phase. It was his, probably, I have no firm statistics on this, but the impression I get at least is that it was his biggest popular success, both in Brazil and internationally. It screened at Cannes in 1969 and won the Best Director prize, which is kind of like a mid-level prize, but still, it's not quite the Palme d'Or, but still a kind of moment of international recognition of his work. And it was a film that really kind of acquired a certain critical unanimity behind it. It was kind of critics of all persuasions rallied behind the film. At this point, he was one of the few filmmakers, to go back to my kind of French research interest, he was one of the few filmmakers who were defended by both Positif and Cahiers du Cinema. There was Jerry Lewis and Glauber Rocha, and that was about it. There weren't many others. In a way, Antonio das Mortes opened a potential pathway for Rocha to carve out a niche for himself as almost a kind of Brazilian Sergio Leone. So this kind of use of the cangaceiro, the mythological kind of elements of, going back to kind of Brazilian folk culture, it was a potential kind of aesthetic option for him to kind of go down that path and kind of make these Brazilian equivalents of spaghetti westerns, feijoada westerns, we could have dubbed them. But that was not a path that he took, and it wasn't in his character, let's say, to take a path like that. He was not a consensual figure by any means. He was the very opposite of that. His modus operandi was divisiveness. Instead, Rocha's future filmmaking was more aptly signaled, I would argue, by a film made nearly simultaneously with Antonio das Mortes, and which I haven't included in that schema because it doesn't quite fit either way, but it does signal the later period, namely Cancer, and I have here 1968 to 1972, which I'll explain in a second. Cancer is undoubtedly, I would argue, the least known, the least watched, and the least understood of Glauber Rocha's feature films, but unjustly so, as I will argue. In many ways, Cancer is actually made simultaneously with Antonio das Mortes is a mirror image of Antonio das Mortes, whereas Antonio das Mortes was a film with a substantial budget, certainly by Glauber Rocha's standards or by the Cinema Novo standards. It was filmed in color on 35mm. It had, kind of very prominent elements of spectacle and film genre to it. It was able to kind of be attractive to a broad audience. Cancer, on the other hand, had literally no budget. There was, it was made without any money. It was made in black and white on 16mm, not particularly intended for any kind of exhibition. And really devoid of spectacle genre to a very limited degree, but in contrast, well, in distinction to Antonio dos Mortos, even though it's a fiction, the documentary effects of the film are actually very strong. It was totally improvised, and the narrative of the film, to the extent that there is one, is actually quite threadbare and almost non-existent. It was a film that was essentially made on the spur of the moment due to delays in filming Antonio dos Mortos. So Glauber Rocha had the entire setup in place to film Antonio dos Mortos, but there was some kind of bureaucratic delay that delayed filming or delayed the start of filming for approximately 1 month. So he already had the actors, he had the equipment, he had the film stock, and he was just sitting around bored and kind of said, "Hey, let's do something," and spent a mere 4 days filming the film. It was filmed as a series of small vignettes, almost as a kind of diversion, just to keep himself and his actors and technicians entertained, with little intention of actually screening it publicly. Certainly not as screening it as like the new Glauber Rocha film. The final film ended up being 86 minutes long, but there was actually only 100 minutes of rushes taken. So it's an extremely kind of efficient use of film material. 100 minutes of rushes divided into 27 takes, filmed over 4 days. That was the filming process. While there was kind of not particularly an intention to distribute it widely, I would not argue that should minimize the importance of the film within Rocha's oeuvre, and in fact the opposite. And Rocha himself did not deny its importance. He said, in a text written at the time, "Cancer, my film made in 16mm, like everything I do is linked to me." So there's, he's definitely personally invested in the project. He compares its relationship to his other films at the time as being like a painter who, on the one hand paints large-scale frescoes and murals and so on and so forth, and on the other hand, paints miniatures. And that's not to say the miniatures are less important than the murals. It's just a different genre of painting. They can have equal kind of status. He further argued, and I'm quoting directly here, "I made the film to show that in the cinema there is not only one path." And so whereas this is a time where there was kind of very heated debates about the aesthetics and politics and so on, and whether you should make this kind of spectacle films oriented to mass audiences, or whether you should kind of go underground and make these highly experimental films. Rocha's argument was the path of the cinema is all paths. So everything is legitimate. It depends kind of filmmakers should be authorized to do both if they feel the need. The other kind of purpose of the film was to experiment with direct sound. This was in his previous films, Terra, transe, Black God, White Devil. Rocha did not work with direct sound. He worked with kind of post-synchronization. In the early 60s, certainly, it was still very new to work with direct sound on location. His films were generally made on location. So it was a new experience for him to actually shoot on location using direct sound. This was, as I'll explain momentarily, at the insistence of Jean Renoir, that he should do this. However, the decision to shoot with direct sound was actually also the source of the problems that he actually had in completing the film. According to Rocha, in his interview with Cahiers du Cinéma in 1969, the sound technician tasked with recording this direct sound was a mystic figure who ended up not properly kind of archiving the sound in such a way that it could be kind of integrated with the shots in a synchronized manner. When Rocha was concerned about this during the shooting, and he said, you got to pay attention to the sound technique. This technician responded reportedly, sound isn't a matter of technique, it's a subjective question. So it's kind of agonized Rocha. He found it, in the end, extremely difficult to actually resync the sound, and this kind of caused delays in the completion of the film. So it was left dormant, unedited, uncompleted, and basically unseen for 4 years. He would later say, this film took me 4 days to shoot and 4 years to edit. This is the kind of irony of this film, which was supposed to be this kind of like little thing that could be done in a very quick and easy manner. Then in 1972, a representative from the experimental department at RAI, the Italian television station, saw the footage on an editing table, and in Rocha's account at least, it practically forced him to finish this film. Said, no, you have to finish it and we'll show it and we'll provide an outlet for it. They provided a certain amount of completion funds and technological aid in order to actually synchronize the sound up and allow Rocha to complete the editing. So it was screened on Italian television in 1972. I don't have any more precise information about that, but Italian television in the 1970s did have certain kind of avenues for experimental filmmakers or filmmakers, kind of beyond the kind of normal commercial channels to actually screen their work. It screened a lot of Stroud films, screened Rossellini's TV programs at this time, and so Rocha's film kind of was part of that tendency within Italian public television in the 1970s. This screening in 1972 was for a long time the only public screening of Cancer. It wouldn't screen in cinemas until the mid-1980s when Embra Filme, the kind of Brazilian film corporation, kind of set up and toured a complete Glauber Rocha retrospective, and we were able to kind of show Cancer as part of that. So since this time there have been rare Cinematheque screenings of the film. In some sense it's become a sort of cinephilic holy grail. When it shows, it's a major event, and the hardcore cinephiles will rush to kind of watch the hidden, mystical Glauber Rocha film that no one else has seen. But it has also had a kind of double existence in the world of film piracy due to the circulation of video dupes of the film circulating. And it is now on YouTube. So there are no more holy grails, I'm afraid, to report. We can, even the most recondite film can now be easily watched on YouTube. YouTube is in a way a repository of audiovisual detritus. Things that aren't commercially in any way rentable end up on YouTube, and we can watch these experimental films that otherwise, you'd have to kind of pass under the table from hand to hand. It was uploaded just to give some details about this, it was uploaded in 2012 and has had 9,375 views. So it's a reasonably significant audience. Probably not comparable to the original Italian TV screening, but certainly comparable to the kind of combined Cinematheque audience of the film. I would argue that that Cancer is thus part of what I would call the dark cinema, in kind of, as a cognate to what we call the dark web, there's kind of the web of piracy, various more semi-legal kind of activities. There was the ownership of this film was extremely unclear because it didn't have any funding from any source, really. It has had no outlet for commercial distribution. It was never released as a VHS or a DVD, and now has this kind of semi-open, semi-legal existence on the internet via YouTube. The YouTube copy is drawn from a Betamax dupe of the film. I know this because roughly 1 hour into the clip that's uploaded to YouTube, we see this beautiful image. Cancer continua proxima beta. So this is a Betamax tapes. In the early 80s, had a limit of 1 hour, so you had to, after an hour, it had to end, and you had to put a new tape in, and so there's this kind of archaeological relic of that media status of the origins of the YouTube clip still present. I have to admit, this is the only way I've actually watched this film on YouTube. I haven't been to a Cinematheque screening of Cancer, to my great regret, to my great chagrin. Discussing films seen on YouTube creates definite problems for the film scholar, for the media scholar. What value should we give to this version of the film? What can we ascribe to authorial intention? And what can we ascribe merely to a bad transfer? How do we go, well, that's what's actually part of the film, and that's just the kind of the bad YouTube kind of copy, the bad pirated kind of version of the film. And this is a particularly perilous procedure with a filmmaker like Glauber Rocha, who kind of delights in doing things that go against the grain of standard filmmaking practice. Most notably, the film doesn't have any credits. There's kind of substituted credits spoken on screen by Rocha. And even more perversely, there are these moments where the sound is so badly distorted and actually kind of dragged out and made incredible. The voices of the characters are made very deep, and this I had originally ascribed to just the bad YouTube transfer, because that often happens when you see things on YouTube. The sound is kind of ends up sounding warped, but according to other scholars, this is actually in the original the original film. In a way, however, YouTube is an uncannily appropriate way to actually view a film like Cancer, with its kind of very deep challenge to our very ideas of what constitutes good and bad cinema. This is kind of, this is great art. This is the great Glauber Rocha making a film, but on the other hand, it's done in a completely amateur context. And with its kind of various forms of provocation against standard notions of what makes good cinema, and has a kind of home movie quality to it, as I'll go into more deeply, and it also I would argue reflects Rocha's ambivalence at this time about the film's distribution. It's almost like he was waiting for YouTube to come along so that the film could just be put on YouTube, and then that would take care of that question that he didn't want to concern himself with. So that's a kind of parenthesis about the film's YouTube existence today, and the way in which most people are actually watching a film like Cancer, but this also applies to many other films. Certainly from the trashy cinema from the 1970s seems to be like YouTube, like that just dominates how you watch these films. Not to say that this film is trash, but other films, certainly. Not to say that trash is bad either. I mean, trash is good. So the other notable formal element of the film, I spoke about it, the use of direct sound, but the other, I guess, really formal distinguishing feature of the film is its exasperation or even exhaustion of the temporality of the shot itself. It kind of experiments with durée, with the kind of felt duration, and really kind of pushes the duration of shots and duration of images and duration of sequences to the very limits of what the spectator can tolerate. Glauber Rocha has described his approach to filming and to kind of structuring the film in the following terms. Since I know that the Exile, which was the 16mm camera that he used to shoot the film, has a cartridge of up to 11 to 12 minutes, I decided to make a film in which each shot lasted one cartridge, and study this quasi-elimination of montage when there is a constant verbal and psychological action within a single take. He kind of, this idea of kind of pushing this kind of long take aesthetic to its very extremes was seen by Rocha himself as part of a strategy of, in his words, kind of inserting the modern theatre into the cinema. So the modern theatre of the late 1960s, at least, there's kind of tendencies of like living theatre and so on, theatre as a kind of happening, as a kind of, as this kind of very improvised phenomenon. Statements like this have led to what I would argue is a certain misunderstanding of the film. It's in some accounts of the film, possibly by people who actually didn't see it, it's described as just a kind of, putting like 8 or 9 10-minute shots like end to end, and then that's the film. In fact, the majority of shots are shorter than an entire reel, and they're actually also occasionally highly edited or montage sequences where you actually get a kind of rapid-fire editing of shots. Not Eisensteinian in any sense, but certainly more than this idea of just having kind of 10 to 11-minute shots throughout the entire film. Elsewhere, however, the shots do stretch far beyond the normal kind of spectatorial expectations of filmmaking. Moreover, in these kind of extremely long and distended shots, the actors essentially improvise and continue and go on until they have nothing more to give. So there's this kind of like, the shots go on for too long. They go on for way more than is actually necessary to, or, in the kind of standard vision of filmmaking. Moreover, the actors in this kind of improvisatory mode of performance have a tendency to slip in and out of character or even change characters to a certain degree. They also frequently kind of acknowledge the camera, look into the camera, kind of address the camera almost. But this is all kept in its kind of integrality. So there's moments where the kind of the film kind of steps outside of itself, and in that sense, it's also kind of, that's where I think this element of the film as a happening in the kind of model of the living theatre is kind of present. Moreover, there are a couple of notable street sequences in the film where the boundary between documentary and fiction is totally demolished, and you have these kind of fictional characters interacting with kind of people on the street. In terms of Rocha's aesthetic or cinematic influences at this point in time, Jean Godard is usually the first point of reference and the kind of go-to figure for attempts to discuss Rocha's work. And align it with kind of European equivalents or European models. This, of course, is especially prevalent due to his famous cameo in Vinzenz, Godard's film from 1969, in which he kind of is this almost Christ-like figure pointing away to what he calls the dangerous, divine, and marvelous cinema of the Third World. There are certain resonances between Cancer and some of Godard's films from 1968, 1969. I'm thinking of 1+1, Un film comme les autres. But I would also not want to kind of stress the Godardian aspect of the film to the exclusion of other possible influences. More explicit, and certainly Glauber Rocha himself did not do that with Cancer. He ascribed, there were more explicit models that he kind of ascribed for his film, one being Jacques Rivette's Amour Fou from 1967. According to Sylvie Pierre, a French critic who was very close to Rocha, they attended a screening of Amour Fou together in Paris during its initial release, and he came out of it saying, Amour Fou, this is a tropicalist film. So if Rivette had unwittingly made a French tropicalist film in Rocha's mind. Certainly with both Amour Fou, but then also Out One, which is not an influence on Cancer because it's made in 1970. There are distinct parallels between this kind of, first of all, the pushing of the extensiveness or extension of the shot temporally, but also that kind of fluid boundary between fiction and documentary. There's a fantastic scene in Out One in particular where Jean-Pierre Léaud is walking down the street and kind of in a kind of trance-like state, and these local street kids are kind of following him and jumping into the frame because they like being on camera. And there's actually a very similar scene in Cancer. So possibly there's a kind of mutual influence there as well. That Cancer, I don't know the extent to which Rivette even was exposed to the film, but certainly some affinities. Even more, I guess. Pertinent for Rocha was the work of Jean-Marie Stroud and Daniel Houillet at this point. In his own account, he had long conversations with Stroud about the sequence shot in Berlin, and these conversations essentially resulted in him adopting this modus operandi for Cancer. So it's kind of, he was enamored with Chronique de Anna Magdalena Bach by Stroud, which was a film made in 1967. Actually, I would argue, again, the work on the sound in Cancer actually has certain parallels with Automne, which was made in 1969. So once again, kind of after Cancer, but in a way made in the same type of spirit. In his account, when he's talking about the films of Stroud, he actually devoted a whole article to Stroud's work in the late 1960s. But he also said that he's like, well, I make very different films to Jean-Marie Stroud, but in fact, I don't like my own films. I like his films. You don't have to make the films that you like. I mean, this is just what I make. That's not what I like Stroud, but I don't make the films like him, but that's what I like. My work is too baroque. He's like rigorous and austere, and that's really good. Don't know how much we should give credence to that argument, but it's interesting at least. And then finally, which I also mentioned, Jean Renoir. He had encounters with Renoir where Renoir convinced him of the kind of moral imperative of shooting synchronized sound. So that was also an importance for Rocha. He also lamented the deplorable state of synchronization and dubbing in Latin America. So he said, like, even if the sync sound that you do is bad, that's still better than this kind of terrible dubbing that the Latin American film industry does. To move more to the kind of, I guess, thematic aspects of the film, the major theme of the film for Glauber Rocha is violence, or in his words, psychological, sexual, racial violence, all this on the level of improvisation. I think we can definitely draw kind of interesting parallels between the film and certain arguments he makes in text, such as Aesthetics of Dream, this idea of kind of liberating irrationalities that form a kind of revolutionary opposition to what he calls colonializing rationalism, which we also, I believe with Peter Schultz's talk yesterday, kind of alluded to. Sylvie Pierre, in her response to the film, in her monograph on Glauber Rocha, writes that there is no story, strictly speaking, in the film. Story, histoire in the French, with a small h. But there is plenty of history, histoire, big H, in the film. This is essentially because it's really, and I would argue probably one of its most valuable aspects is its status as a document of the very moment of its filming. It was filmed in August 1968, which is to say in this kind of interlude period after the mass protests, June 26th, the March of the 100,000, as the kind of the summit of this kind of mass opposition movement in Brazil, but before the military crackdown on December 13th, the Institutional Act No. 5 and the beginning of torture and repression and very harsh censorship regime. So it documents a certain mentality amongst this kind of left counterculture milieu that swings in an almost schizophrenic manner between ebullience and paranoia. So you have on the one hand the great possibilities of the contestation of the political movement and artistic countercultures that give rise to great optimism, and then a deep and profound nagging pessimism about the reality, the impending reality that was already in the air of intense state repression. In a way, it's a kind of psychodrama of the traumas of 1968. And I think 1968, certainly in my own research with relationship to, kind of the French 1968, all the main figures involved in that period were deeply traumatized by 68. This is kind of, the possibilities open up, but then they are not realized, and that's a kind of traumatic encounter with the real. And in Brazil, this is even more exacerbated given the kind of political consequences of 68. It is also a very fascinating document of Brazilian counterculture on the level of the figures actually on screen in the film. So there are three main characters in Cancer who are actually, all three of whom were actors who were supposed to be used in Antônio das Mortes. One being Antonio Pechanga, who plays a character called the Marginal Black, who actually doesn't end up appearing in Antônio das Mortes. He couldn't, for whatever reason, couldn't actually appear in the film, and Rocha lamented this, saying, well, there was supposed to be a role for a black figure in Antônio das Mortes, and he had to leave and it didn't work out. But he does appear in very prominently in Cancer. Hugo Cavana plays the Marginal White. I'll get into these character names in a second, although they never appear in the actual film itself. These are only kind of drawn from production notes. And finally, Odete Lara, who plays the wife or the romantic partner of Hugo Cavana, the Marginal White. Secondary appearances in the film, however, are made, as I mentioned, by Elio Witishika, but also Rosario Duarte, another iconic figure in the Tropicalismo movement, and Eduardo Coutinho, the documentary filmmaker who I just learnt was murdered in 2014, allegedly by his own son. So tragic denouement to his life, but an important filmmaker in his own right. So some of the leading figures in Tropicalismo and the Brazilian counterculture are present in the film, but I would argue that Glauber Rocha has a distinctly ambivalent relationship with the movement, and that this is very forthright in Cancer, as we'll see momentarily. The film, as I mentioned, has a very loose and minimal narrative, but there's a storyline is not totally absent from the film. So I'll just do a kind of a very brief overview of the plot to the extent to which there is one. The Cancer begins with footage of a packed auditorium at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro with the audience, and we see, don't see it here, but we do see images of the audience, and it's kind of totally packed, full of young people, listening to a panel of intellectuals and artists speaking about the heightened political situation in this moment in August 1968. But the interventions can barely be heard on the soundtrack of the film, which is smothered by Glauber Rocha's own voiceover, which is here substituting for the non-existent credits, so describing, this is a film, Cancer, by Glauber Rocha, but also describes, from the point of view of 1972, the conditions in which the film was originally shot in 1968. So this voiceover by Rocha is already placing the film in the past tense, so to speak. This is a film that's a document of its time, but no longer kind of a document of the present time, let's say. The voiceover states, it was in Rio de Janeiro in August 1968 in a suspended agitation. There were students and workers in the streets, workers occupying the factories. It was the dictatorship of Costa e Silva, the second dictator since Castelo Branco. So it's dictatorship, but also kind of contestatory political movements. In the next scene, we're introduced to Antonio Pechanga's character. I apologize for the poor quality of the images, but yeah, also very appropriate. The Marginal Black, he is homeless, starving, and is desperately looking for work. And he kind of unwittingly intrudes into what seems to be a kind of artist colony populated by Duarte and Wojtyszka. So we see Duarte is kind of on the extreme left of the screen, barely visible, and Wojtyszka on the extreme right. In the middle, there's a kind of also a black musician who I don't recognize and couldn't find any information as to who it is, but who plays a tambourine almost throughout the entire scene of this and other scenes. Pechanga begs these artists for work or for help of any kind. He's starving, he's desperate, but he only meets with their mocking indifference. So it's not a very say palatable depiction of this artistic milieu. The Marginal Black then encounters Hugo Carvana's Marginal White. Together they attempt to sell off a strange black device, which we can see in the corner of the screen here, which is it's never properly explained what this is supposed to be, and in fact it's a mystery to the characters themselves. Pechanga, the Marginal Black, had stolen it from an American, according to the dialogue, but has no idea, neither him nor Hugo Carvana has any idea what it's supposed to be used for, and they try to sell it off to kind of rich, stupid white people. Hugo Carvana says, well, if you stole it from an American, it must be complicated, it must be a complex device of some kind, so it's probably got to be worth money. So they encounter each other, they embark on this common mission of kind of trying to pawn off this weird device, this negocio. And so in some sense a parallel seems to be drawn between the marginal existences of the Marginal Black and the Marginal White, but let's say the differences in their marginality are just as apparent. Pechanga lives on the streets, he's homeless, he's in a state of absolute deprivation and kind of is faced with public indifference to his own deprivation. He's, a figure that Giorgio Agamben would call a homo sacer. He's kind of an archetypal kind of, excluded, marginal figure. Carvana's character has a more bourgeois existence. He lives in a house. It's a sign of the bourgeoisie. He watches TV with his wife, another sign of the bourgeoisie. But his marginality, let's say, is the fact that he's prone to a certain psychosexual humiliation. His wife is openly cheating on him, Odette Lara playing the wife, with a younger, more handsome man, and kind of even mocks him for it. So this is, I believe that's also Rosario Duarte playing this kind of the lover of Odette Lara. Interestingly, Pechanga, the Marginal Black, has actually has an affectionate relationship with a black woman. Skipping over that, in a very long and kind of detailed scene, which one critic has noted is basically the only scene in all of Glauber Rocha's work that is in any way a kind of love scene, or a scene where characters are actually kind of genuinely affectionate towards each other. The friendship between the Marginal Black and the Marginal White, however, is a short-lived one. During a trip to the beach, The marginal black makes love to a jete lara and then strangles the marginal white. And he and the jete lara then run off with the suitcase of the marginal white. We never find out what's in the suitcase. This is left as a mystery. But there's this kind of idea that, oh, this must be full of cash, and they're running off to, they're rich now, they've made it, and everything's going to work out. That is not the case, however, and the marginal black returns to this kind of panhandling existence. He wanders the streets of Rio de Janeiro in a very extended sequence, begging for work or money from, at least it appears, genuine people. This is kind of a scene where fiction and documentary are totally kind of, or the boundary between the two are totally obliterated. Antonio Pechanga is kind of like accosting people who happen to be on the streets of Rio de Janeiro, and they kind of fend him off with all their might. So this narrative overview that I've just given makes the plot of the film seem at least somewhat comprehensible. But this is a little bit misleading because this is the result of multiple viewings and kind of recourses to auxiliary kind of critical and scholarly materials. Certainly on an initial viewing, the main impression is chaos and incomprehension. My description also elides numerous digressions in the film and the kind of general semantic instability of the characters. They're not psychologically well-drawn characters, and they often adopt different personas, and there's kind of either the personas of themselves, the actors, or just kind of totally different characters. There is, for instance, a long sequence where the marginal white, and I believe this is in an earlier image that I had, interrogates a Marxist militant played by Eduardo Coutinho, and in this scene, he kind of goes from being this marginal figure, this petty kind of criminal who's out, scheming and scamming, to basically a cop. I mean, the way he interrogates this Marxist militant, he's basically adopting the persona of a kind of thuggish cop. But if I can go back here, the final scene of the film, and this happens even after this kind of panhandling scene, is, I would argue, the most interesting scene of the film. Here, Pechanga, who's essentially at the end of his tether, both materially and psychologically, once again encounters this group of artists with Wojtyszka and Duarte and others as they are engaged in a kind of trance-like happening in the park. They're playing music. Certainly Wojtyszka seems very evidently on drugs at this point. Not an exceptional moment in his life. And Pechanga kind of invades this space. He breaks out into a violent rage at the kind of blithe incomprehension of his social situation, and ends up grabbing a gun from Wojtyszka, shooting Rosario Duarte and then Wojtyszka himself, before turning to the camera and shouting repeatedly, "I want to kill the world is rotten." So I wanted to show there is, and I just want to finish on this note, kind of 1 or 2 minutes left, by saying, there is a profound ambiguity of this scene. Are we to read it that Glauber Rocha is essentially killing off tropicalismo? He's, killing Rosario Duarte and Elio Wojtyszka, and at the hands of the black sub-proletariat, no less. I mean, is this kind of hostile engagement with tropicalismo that is kind of, attempting to destroy it? His later relations with certainly the countercultural left in Brazil would support such a reading, that kind of hostile relationship he would have with them later in the 1970s. And even at the time that Cancer was made, he would argue the Uji-Gruji, this kind of Brazilian underground, is an abortive failure that restores the decadent formalism of Anastasia's lover, Anastasia, the Serena, killed by the Bolsheviks. The first and only film of the 68 underground is Cancer, made by Glauber Rocha, with his typical modesty, stating that. So we could read it as that. We could read it as Glauber Rocha is killing tropicalismo. The black sub-proletariat is killing tropicalismo. Because tropicalismo is this kind of elite artistic movement by the kind of, the white bourgeoisie. This reading, however, also is totally undermined by the ludic, farcical nature of the scene, as we've just seen. This is not a scene that is operating in the mode of serious, straight-faced realism. Instead, it is kind of working in a playful pantomime-like mode, and it is obviously also a scene that has the willing complicity of Duarte and Wojtyszka themselves. I mean, they are participating in the scene, presumably aware that they're being killed off in the film. Should we then understand this scene to be nothing more than a big insider joke? Where they're just all having a laugh at this kind of proposition. Yeah, that Glauber Rocha, what a prankster, is killing off tropicalism. Yeah, let's have a big laugh about it. Perhaps, if this was the case, this could lead us to more generally revise Rocha's provocative interventions, the target of whose derision, certainly in the 1970s, became his former comrades in arms in the Cinema Novo and parallel artistic movements. Perhaps in the end, his alienation from his own cultural milieu was based on a misrecognition of the satirical, parodic, or joke-like nature of the mode of address adopted by Glauber Rocha. And that's the proposition I want to end my intervention with.
Okay. I'm going to try and enforce at least a semblance of adherence to the schedule. As I said, it's a leisurely paced event, and we're handling it in that way. Hello, everybody. For the last 2.5 days, or let me start this differently. Sociologist Gilberto Freire famously said in the 1930s that Brazil was a racial democracy, and that all kinds of gradations of racial identity were, given a social space to live together on equal footing, which obviously was a rather optimistic take on the social structure and politics of Brazil, certainly then and even now. But what he certainly was referring to is the fact that Brazil is composed of 3 large ethnic groups. There are the European white immigrants, there's the Afro-Brazilian population, and of course the indigenous Indian population. And lest we delude ourselves, for the last 2 days we have mostly been discussing white middle class and upper middle class culture. We have had some elements of Afro-Brazilian culture that played into the works and phenomena that we discussed, but it's mostly the socially and economically dominant stratum and group of society that has been the focus of what we've been talking about. And we have certainly the least attention of all the 3 groups in terms of the attention that we've devoted to them are the Indians, and we now have a keynote that is going to mend that to a considerable extent. I think it's important to do that. We've been discussing anthropophagy as a theoretical concept, as a cultural practice, which of course is a sort of a powerful metaphor coined by a white upper middle class member of the avant-garde in the 1920s, but with reference to a cultural practice of the indigenous population, which already was sort of an appropriation. And one of the key characters in 1920s avant-garde literature, and also again Cinema Novo, of course, is Macunaíma, who's a shape-shifting inhabitant of the Amazons who moves to the city and is capable of adopting also physically to his surroundings. And in an inspired choice, of course, of casting in Joaquim Pedro de Andrade's film of Macunaíma, the indigenous Macunaíma is played by Grande Otelo, who is the big star of the Chanchada films and an Afro-Brazilian movie star from the 1950s. So that all of that comes into play. So in order to synthesize our discussion of the last 2 days, We now move on to the keynote by Robert Stam. None of this would have been complete without Robert Stam's participation. I'm really glad that we could get you here for this conference and that you accepted to hold the keynote here. I have to actually look at my list here to get a grip on all your publications. Bob Stam has been a professor of cinema studies at one of the most important schools in our field, NYU, since 1977. He's the author of some 17 books on film, the media, and cultural studies. He's published books on François Truffaut, on literature and film. He has written a comprehensive introduction to film theory for Blackwell, which has become a work of reference in all our undergraduate courses. But most importantly for our conference here, he's the author of Tropical Multiculturalism, a comparative history of race in Brazilian cinema and culture, which came out from Duke in 1997. And he has co-authored with Ella Shohat, Unthinking Eurocentrism, 1994, Multiculturalism, Postcoloniality and Transnational Media, and Flagging Patriotism, Crisis of Narcissism, and Anti-Americanism. So his scope is vast, but he's also certainly one of the leading figures in film studies and cultural studies working on Brazilian culture of the 20th century and the popular culture and counterculture. And we're very proud to have you here. So the title of the talk, again, bringing together all the threads of our discussion, is Anthropophagy, the Carib Revolution and Popular Culture, the Transnational Gaze on the Radical Indian. Please, Robert Stam.
So I'm amazed that anyone would thank me for coming here. For me, it's a total delight, and it's like a perfect audience where they say of couples that they finish each other's sentences. I'm sure we might not finish each other's sentences, but we can finish each other's quotations. If I say seja marginal, you would say? If I say muita saúva? Pouca saúde. Ah, pouca saúde. Claro, claro. If I say come bosta? Mas não aposta. Right. Anyway, so it's a call and response technique. Anyway, I'm really delighted to be here. This has been a really precious experience, and I'm going to do what I never do, which is, this has been a very personal experience for me because it combined the idea of 68 and the idea of much that I most love, like Tropicalia and Brazilian music and Anthropophagia, etc. And so I wanted to say, and it rhymes a bit with what Max was saying about the transnational experience of 68 and that there were different 68s. And I only thought about this here, that one of the unifying factors in all the 68s was hatred for the war against Vietnam by the American Army. So I lived that. I was a student at the time, and there was the danger of being drafted. So a lot of millions of young Americans would go to Canada or hide or pretend to be retarded or whatever not to join the war. So it was because of that that I went to Tunisia and joined the Peace Corps. I almost said Peace Corps, Peace Corps. And I avoided the war that way and had a wonderful and learned so much in Tunisia. And there was a vital student movement, and Foucault was there at the time and praised the Tunisian students for the maturity. So the movement there was anti-war, it was about the Middle East, it was about authoritarian government in Tunis and so forth. So in 68 I was in Tunis, and while I was in Tunisia, I went to Prague in August. I sound like the Mick Jagger character. Let me introduce myself. So I was there just before the Soviet invasion, and then of course in Prague it was all about socialism with a human face. It was anti-Soviet, it was pro-democracy, a new kind of combination of socialism and democracy. Then I went back to Tunis, then I went to Paris in September of 68 and lived that. I was very happy to be beat up by the police, so I could tell you that I was beat up by the police. I didn't express gratitude at the time, but in retrospect, I'm grateful. And then I met the woman who became my wife, Gilda Penteado, in Paris. And then I lived a very Brazilian Paris through her, and her brother produced São Paulo S.A. and Amor e Niña. Her sister worked with Sonia Braga at her first film, Amor e Niña. So through her, I met a lot of artists, a lot of exiles already, Celso Nunes, the theater director. Then we went to Berkeley, which was another epicenter of all these activities in '69. So the literal 68, I had 3 68s, Prague, Tunis, and Paris. And then I had the Berkeley long 68. And then I went to Brazil in '71, where there was, of course, repression and dictatorship and resistance to it. And also in Berkeley, it was a very Brazilian Berkeley, because I was part of a group of Brazilians who, for instance, Living Theater, who had been tortured in Brazil, would come and talk to us. Activists like Marcos Arruda, if people know him, he would come and visit us and talk about the movement and introduce us to music. And then so there was Brazil in '71, so that's the 5th 68. And then I was in Paris again in '74, and there was a revolution in Lisbon, 25 de Abril. So a week after that happened, I went there and filmed some of the demonstrations, and total euphoria in the streets of Lisbon. I remember I asked, what's the name of the street? They said, Avenida da Liberdade. Now it has a meaning. And all the bookstores would have all the books that they wouldn't let you read, right? And all the PG agents, they would have pictures, watch out for these people and so forth. So these are my 6 68s. And I never thought about it, that the Vietnam War totally changed the course of my life. So if you think about your life, what would not have happened if this hadn't happened, other things wouldn't have happened. So that was a whole chain of events. So I never do this, but here I feel comfortable doing that. So basically what I want to do, I like combining clips and concepts. When I teach Brazilian cinema in New York, I always start with a music video, and Brazilian music talks about absolutely everything. So there's always something that's related to the theme. So you saw Adriana Calcanhoto singing Vamos Comer Caetano, which is obviously relevant to our themes. So also in teaching, Danny talked about YouTube, and YouTube has transformed my teaching because it made so much available. And more and more I show the films, I show feature, I show documentary, but I also show music video, web series, Porta dos Fundos, and so forth. That's kind of this mediatic spectrum, right? Also, I realized that I am very fond of trance words. So over my trajectory, first it was translinguistics, Bakhtin, Voloshidov. Then it was transtextuality, Jeanette, and then transnational. So I have a great fondness for everything that's transnational, transmediatic, transartistic. And this conference has been very transartistic. It combines different arts, music and theater performance and so forth. So we'll go back to, I also want to talk about this transnational connection of Brazil 68 with France, and also especially about the indigenous figure, the French gaze on the Brazilian Indian, the German gaze on the Indian in general, including the Brazilian Indian, and also the US gaze, and talk about the indigène as an exemplar of the idea of freedom, right? So we'll start with Terra in transe. This is 30-second sequence, which somebody said there's little histoire, but lots of history, right? So not much story, but a palimpsest of centuries of history in this 30-second sequence. Really astonishing sequence. Moacir talked about the impact of Terra in transe on Tropicalia, Oiticica, and so forth, and José Celso. And this kind of scene, for me, I've seen it 50 times, and I always see new dimensions of it. There's not a word except in Yoruba, but the fact that it's the theatricality of it. He turns the beach into a stage, and all the actors that he chose have an importance. Like Paulo Tron was very much associated with classical theater, Greek plays, Shakespeare, and so forth. The man who plays the conquistador is Clovis Bornai, who was a carnivalesco in Rio's Carnival and famous for historical costumes, right? So he makes a link with carnival, and there's a certain carnivalization in this film as well. I think I would call it a Trauerspiel, kind of a Baroque allegory, and it's explicitly allegorical in the sense that he got rid of any signs in Portuguese, so it's kind of pan-Latin American. So he puts in Portuguese and Spanish names, like Julio Fuentes and Porfirio Diaz, this character right here. His name is that of a Mexican leader who ruled Mexico for 35 years. Porfirio, they call him Diaz, but it's Porfirio Diaz. So what's amazing in this sequence is that he fuses 5 centuries of history in one shot through costume. So you see Porfirio, who's associated with the coup d'etat in '64, but they're playing out the Primera Misa. Like Lena mentioned, where's Lena? You mentioned the Primera Misa, the painting by Victor Mireles, right? And there's another intertextual reference, which is the film by Humberto Mauro, Discovery of Brazil, in 1937, which is modeled on the painting by Victor Mireles, the mise en scène, the lighting, and so forth. And it's all portrayed as if the Indians spontaneously adhere to Christianity. They start to kneel. They make gestures toward conversion, right? And this, you'll notice, is the opposite, right? And notice there's kind of an equality in regalia between the conquistador and the Tupinamba, right? They both have feathers. If in the long shots, they look like equals. So it's not the dressed European against the naked sauvage, right? And if you go to Quai Branly Museum in Paris, you see the Tupinamba regalia, which is very elaborate. And the king, Kunyambebi, who appears in How Taste Was My Frenchman, was treated as a monarch by the French Protestants led by Villegagnon. They were honoring him and so forth. So we forget sometimes, you just imagine total slaughter. There were alliances between the Tupinamba and the French and the Tupiniquim and the Portuguese. So every member of the scene represents a figure of power in some different way. And then the amazing thing is the music. I call Glauber Rocha trance Brechtian. He was Brechtian. You know, he saw Drei Groschen Oper in 1960 and loved it. Said he always says Brecht was one of his gurus, along with Eisenstein and Shakespeare, Orson Welles. But what was I going to say? The music, of course. Yeah. So he's trance Brechtian in the sense trance with an S and trance with a C, right? Because he goes beyond Brecht, but through trance. So you have music of trance. There are 2 of his titles reference trance, right? Barravento is a moment in Candomblé of kind of this loss of equilibrium before the onset of trance, right? So he's explicitly referencing trance in 2 of his films, right? And then Terra and transe. In this music, there are almost no black characters except Zozimo Bobul, who appears as a reporter. And yet Africa is present through the music. And then I say it's trans-Brechtian because you have a Catholic ceremony, but the music of the religion that was repressed by Christianity, right? And we tend to think, okay, there's the Inquisition over here, and then there's Africans and indigenous people who were forced converted but it's a continuum, right? They're all forced conversions, right? But we don't see it in the same paradigm. So, all right, let's move on. So this very radical use of music, and you know, you mentioned the 3 basic groups, right? They're all present in this scene. You have Africa through the music, you have the indigenous character, who's probably played by a non-indigenous character, because Indians could not act in films until the Constitution of 1988. So if they were, you know, Indians who lived in their own territories, they could not act in films. So it was probably just the mestizo carioca who's playing the role, which was typical of Brazilian films. All right, let's see what's next. Okay, let's go to Zé Celso. who, as we've all said, was partially inspired by Terra and transe. So instead of Hediger, you all know about Hediger, you've seen that. I want to jump to farther along in the version of Hamlet by Celso. The structure of my talk I'm basing on the Cannibalist Manifesto. In other words, it's all over the map and full of aphoristic, telegraphic statements and so forth. That's my justification for the chaotic presentation. Anyway, so here you have the tupification of Hamlet, right, in the most famous phrase. And I'm trying to connect everything with something Oswald said in the manifesto. For instance, he pointed out there is no verb to be in tupi, right, which is also true of Arabic and Hebrew, right? And some people say the history of Western philosophy has been about the verb to be, essences, existences, attributes, predicates, and so forth. We'll ask the philosopher to comment on that. But I think it's interesting that in Portuguese, you have to choose between ser and estar. And he emphasizes more estar, more transient situation, right? One thing I would say both about this and Terra and transe is both 20s modernism and Tropicalia and Anthropophagy were very much ahead of the curve in terms of decolonial issues. And this is in the 1920s. If you think about it, Oswald uses a lot of verbs with des at the beginning, right? De-Vespucciize, de-Columbusize, de-Cabral-ize, right? And this very popular word, decolonial, right? It sort of replaced post-colonial. So if you think of it, here's this gesture which was profoundly anti-Eurocentric back in the 20s. So this prefix, I think, is very important. Also, it's different from the post-colonial movement of the 80s in the sense that post-colonial studies tended to emphasize the latter-day empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, American Empire, and so forth, whereas Oswald is talking about the foundational empire, which is the dispossession of indigenous peoples, right? And that was a foundational dispossession which actually made way for the other empires. And I think post-colonial studies in the early 80s sort of forgot that other dispossession. I think that's very important. So they were ahead of the curve in that sense. And another point I would like to make, it strikes me, it was only here that I thought about this, is there should be a study of comparative modernisms. And I'm sure many of you have this frustration. You pick up a book on modernism, I always look for Oswald in the index. And 95% of the time, he's not there, but he should be, right? So it's as if modernism is purely European. There's no Brazilian modernism. And I think if you really think about it, with all its problems, Brazilian modernism was relatively advanced. It was symbolically feminist. I don't know about it in practice, but the whole idea of Pindorama, of matriarchy in Oswald's work, whereas the avant-gardes in Europe and the US were extremely sexist and so forth. So that's another thing to think about. So let's go to Macunaíma. The great thing is I don't have to explain. I don't have to present Macunaíma. You all know it. So I'll just, let's see just a brief moment from Macunaíma. Well, first, actually, this is a preamble that he wrote for the Venice Film Festival. So Joaquin is giving a kind of didactic summary of the leitmotifs of anthropophagy, right? And I think it's interesting in two ways. It's a hermeneutic key to the film. First of all, there are two poles of anthropophagy. One is the positive pole, which is the idealizing respect for indigenous social structures, right? And the other is the cannibalism, the critique, the negative pole. So he emphasizes, after the coup d'etat and after the radicalization of the coup d'etat, the negative angle. The rich eat the poor eat each other, the left devours itself. I love that line about left sectarianism, that we devour ourselves in sectarianism. So he's giving you keys to how to read the film. And in the film, all these negative things happen. The rich eat the poor eat each other, and so forth. But in this preface, he's combining what he knows and loves about Oswald, and we know he made a film, Homem do Brasil, about Oswald, combining that in the preface, because Macunaíma was not particularly anthropophagic. You have the cannibal giant, you have Yara, but it's not central to the novel. The novel could exist without cannibalism. So he's combining Oswald with Mario, despite the tensions and differences between them. So let's go to the next one, which is, I call it the devoured. We all know that Caetano said, we in Tropicalia devoured the modernists in Europe, devoured Dada and Surrealism. We devoured Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, right? So this was an event that has Caetano devoured, as also happened in the Adriana Calcanhoto song, Vamos Comer Caetano. Brazil. I don't know of many countries that would have had that scene, right? A pop star being devoured. But it's very Orfeo, very Orpheus, being devoured and so forth. So a wonderful little episode. He was just attending the play, and then they invited him. And what was the phrase? Baba Anthropophagica, right? They're giving their breasts, so it's kind of, milk that he's milking. Let's go. Here's another, the theme of eating the other. This is from Karamuru. It was a TV series, it was a film, it was a documentary in 2000 commemorating the quincentenary of Cabral. Gail Arraes and Jordi Furtado did it. So there's a scene of a cooking lesson about how to cook a Portuguese person, and you can feed 60 people with a good fat Portuguese person. So, boa receita. So, talvez hoje à noite tem restaurante que serve. No, sorry, scoping. Okay, so everyone knows that Mario de Andrade is partially inspired by Koch Grünberg's texts from, what's the title? Anyway, part of it came out volume 1 came out in Portuguese a few years ago, and I was reading it and discovered that he had a camera and took a lot of photos, and he worked about the Talipang group, and that he also made a film. And thanks to the internet, you were talking about this, what the internet makes available. His film from 1911, which is Aus dem Leben der Talipang, is available on the internet. It's about 15 minutes long, so I just want to show a minute since you can all see it. But I thought that's very interesting that the person who inspired with his collection of tales from the different indigenous groups actually made a film. So let's see. Anyway, it's actually a beautiful film, and it gives a very peaceful portrait, and it contrasts with those anthropological films where, even with the Rondon Commission, where they're using the measurement, sort of, you mentioned Petit à Petit, the Jean Rouge film, where the African is measuring the Parisians, right? So it's interesting, he went to really hear their stories and understand their stories, and he said you have to stay a long time, otherwise you make errors of interpretation. So, all right, you get the idea. Now, you know all this term from James Clifford, the ethnographic surrealists. People like Michel Arhis, who were French people who would go to Africa and be inspired artistically by African art, that kind of thing. I think you can see Mario de Andrade as kind of an ethnographic surrealist. He works on the basis of this ethnographer's work, and he himself was an ethnomusicologist, right? And he's very surreal, with the difference that he's much more of an insider to his own culture. Obviously, he's not a European going to Africa or having contact with indigenous people. So Koch Grünberg has this very nice portrait of the group, and there's kind of a leitmotif in this literature of how indigenous people are very nice to their children. Remember, Rousseau talked about we shouldn't have diapers, it's like a prison, and the Indians, the Sauvage, don't do that. Jean Delarue talks about how he never saw them abuse children. Levi-Strauss also said, I never saw them slap their children, etc. And Koch Grünberg wrote the following: "The children are the most happy creatures you could ever imagine. They happily accept all the games I propose. They are friendly and educated with me and in grand harmony among themselves. If I give one child a piece of chocolate, he or she instantly offers it to the other." So a link to Oswald. Do you remember Oswald would always talk about tínhamos felicidade, right? Before the conquest, we had happiness. So it's as if the conquest didn't bring progress, but really destroyed it in this view. So, and Koch Grünberg talks about the legends of Macunaíma, which were very popular in different groups around Roraima. And Macunaíma was kind of a demiurge, so he created animals and shaped the landscape, but he was also a trickster figure, right? So the native people found it very amusing when they would use Macunaíma to say God, because he's a very mischievous trickster spirit. He's not at all like the Christian God. I was telling Maíra, because I love indigenous names, that I wanted to name my son Macunaíma. But at that time, the English translation was Jungle Freaks. So I would have ruined his life. I still wish I could have. Anyway. Actually, just before I left, a Brazilian friend gave me an amulet like Macunaíma's. Totally tacky plastic, but we'll see. Anyway, I wonder, one thing I would speculate about is that Barrio de Andrade was partially of indigenous ancestry, researched indigenous people, and I'm wondering if Oswald saw Indians more as an abstraction and didn't know that much about indigenous people. Like apparently at one point they didn't think there were any Tupi around or the language wasn't spoken. Whereas Mario perhaps was more invested and involved in this kind of knowledge. That's something I'd like to research. If anyone knows, I would love to know. So, all right, let's go to the beginning of Macunaíma. I love that. You know, the voices, I've shown this film so many times, and often I'll sit outside the classroom and read the paper or something. And the noises are very guttural, very animalic. You know, it's all all the time. And then everyone has a certain different voice. And then I think he plays with different styles of acting. Like, what's his name? Jardel Filho came from kind of the leftist theater. Others, Angewandte comes from chanchada and this broad style of acting. So it becomes kind of a counterpoint of acting styles. And their movements are very bodily, and you know, they lead with the stomach kind of thing. So it's very interesting to look at the performance. So this famous subtitle, The Hero Without Character, which is both in terms of ethos, right? He's a trickster figure. He's very diverse in his ethics, but it's also ethnos, right? Have people compared the Musil, Man Without Qualities, to Macunaíma? I would love to see a deep analysis of, I'm assuming it's an intra-ethnic, there's no ethnic variation in that book, right? But yeah. So to connect this with Oswald, he says, we Brazilians are champions of miscegenation, both in racial and cultural terms. So you have that very much manifested here. Hybridity, I get very irritated when people write what Homi Bhabha calls hybridity. Hybridity has been around for a long time before Homi Bhabha. And do you know the malicious little joke that Brazilians do with his name? People know this? O homem que baba. So very mean, very mean. So anyway, this beginning really epitomizes the carnivalesque. You know, Bakhtin said the favored image of carnival was the pregnant hag, the old woman who gives birth to new life. Right. So you have cross-dressing as part of the carnivalesque. So you have a man in drag giving birth to an adult man, playing very well a baby. And in carnival, medieval carnival, was a figure called puer rex. You know, they would have a boy bishop, a boy king. And what do you have here? He's the hero of his people, and he's a 50-year-old actor playing a child. So Bakhtin talked about the three spasms, the spasm of birth, the spasm of orgasm, and the spasm of death. And you have all three in the film. Also, the lower bodily stratum. You remember Macunaíma pees on his mother, and she puts up an umbrella. The grotesque body, orifices and protuberances, and so forth. So I wanted to show two kind of afterbirths of Macunaíma. So, whole intertextual series. I don't know if Freudians would say this is womb envy on the part of men, because men cannot create life in the same way. But it's interesting, this became kind of a topos of repeated motif. Okay, so I wanted to move on to Diogo Alvarez and Paraguaçu, kind of the first mixed couple in Brazilian history. And the film, which I showed a sequence of the Portuguese cooking, Caramuru, Invenção do Brasil. Has anybody seen Caramuru? It's a brilliant, witty film with severe political problems. Guerra and Jordi Furtado, incredibly clever. It uses digital techniques to the backs, but there's some problems which I'll mention. But let's see. It does is there's a scene where Diogo Alvarez is a Portuguese cartographer, and he's in Lisbon, and it talks about him. Then it goes to Paraguaçu, saying there is this beautiful Indian woman, and they haven't met, but they will. And it makes a gesture toward reciprocity, cultural reciprocity, using words in Tupi for the stars and words in Portuguese. So there's an attempt to have some sort of cultural equality. Let's see. The Tupi in France, the fact that Caramaru, or Diogo Alvarez, and Paraguaçu married in France in 1528, and she changed her name to Catherine in homage to Catherine of Medici, right? And what I think is interesting, it doesn't happen very much, is imagining a transnational frame for this, because the obvious analogy to Diogo and Paraguaçu would be Pocahontas, right? You have a European man with an indigenous woman, right? But what happens is the fact of mixedness becomes mythic and foundational in Brazil, whereas mixedness in North America becomes a myth of separation, right? So you have similar realities. You know, Native people are very mixed all over the Americas. Anyway, I don't know. But in Brazil, Dara Summers talks about foundational fictions. Right? Yes, let me just introduce it. Thanks. All right, so a lot of Tupi went to France. She wasn't Tupi, I think, but they married in France. So Pocahontas went to England and also changed her name to Rebecca, right? In both cases, they met royalty. So we often forget that Indians were not necessarily totally pathetic creatures. They were meeting with, Pocahontas met with Ben Jonson, the playwright, right? So they had some honor despite the extermination that was happening in the Americans. So what I wanted to talk about is in 1550, there was a famous festivity. Is there a way to stop it? Or? Yeah. No, I'm wondering why we're hearing it. Yeah, okay, anyway. No, I want to talk about it first. So, it was called the Fête de Rouen, and in 1550, the Tupinamba, who were allied with the French, they had I call it a proto-Disney role. They had a huge festivity celebrating the victories of the French and the Tupinamba against the Portuguese. So in the Seine River, they would have model ships, and they would win the struggle. There were speeches in Tupi. There are 20 words, Tupi words in French, toucan, like tucano, right? The word Tupinambo, a friend of mine was in France, and they're hiking, and he sees a root, he says, what's this? And they say, oh, we call it Tupinambo. That could only be Brazilian. That is not part of a Latin language logic, right? So these words are there because a lot of Tupi were there. So in the Fête de Rouen, there were 50 actual Tupi-Namba people and 250 French people painted red at this festivity. Now, the best representation we have of it is a samba pageant in 1994, which talks about the Tupinamba in Rouen. So samba schools are also doing history, right? It's advanced historiography in a way. So freedom to the world and to France, right? So you get liberté, fraternité, etc. And it also gave color because Pau Brasil yielded a dye, which is very fashionable in the elite of the north of France. So that's what they mean by they colored. So there's a lot of research that goes into this. But what interests me is the word freedom. It's Carnival's freedom meets the idea of a freedom associated with the figure of the Indian. Okay, let's see. Yeah, I was going to talk about Caramaru, but we didn't see it, so. I wanted to talk a bit more. We've talked about the limitations of anthropophagy, but I think if you think of comparative modernisms, it was one of the more progressive. I already mentioned the feminist side, but some other points I would make. Oswald rejected the Eurocentric narrativization of artistic modernism, and he did it as often with a joke, right? He said surrealism was the best pre-anthropophagic movement, right? So usually when they talk about the avant-garde, it's the global south imitates the European avant-garde. It's always a pale copy that comes afterwards. So this joke of, surrealism was okay, but we're much beyond them. We devour them, and we're more interesting. It's a joke, but I think he's always critiquing stagist linear narratives. Even this idea that teníamos happiness, we had it, right? It's not we're progressing toward it, but we had it. Another thing that you mentioned is this idea of export quality poetry, right? There's an economic side to this. We're not going to just import, we're going to export our quality biscuit, as it were. Another point is they were kind of post-Marxist in the sense that Anthropophagy devoured Marxism, but also he pointed out that in Brazil there was no proletariat, so you can't really talk in the 20s of a proletariat in Brazil. But also, I think more serious is Oswald criticized the productivism of Marxism. And you remember Baudrillard did a book called The Mirror of Production, and that was the idea that communism was just as productivist as capitalism, and that's why you see ecological devastation in both situations. So that's another strong point, I think. And then, this has been mentioned before, but this very expansive idea of what revolution could be, when Oswald says it's social, it's economics, it's religion, it's all of them together. There's a beautiful phrase from Deleuze where he talks about the assemblage of all the devenir minoritaire, an assemblage of all the minoritarian becomings. And I think that's something like what Oswald is doing. There are two groups that love the figure of the indigent, and that's Marxist. You have the famous Engels talking about the Iroquois, right? But also anarchists. So Pierre Clastre was a French anarchist who went to Brazil, lived with Indians, and saw his own anarchism confirmed with the lifestyle of indigenous people. So moving on to this Franco-indigenous Brazilian dialogue, I like the term Red Atlantic, and the idea is that obviously the Western Hemisphere is red. It's indigenous peoples were there, right? There was a genocide, but they're there. The representatives are still there. They're alive and active. But also Europe, and Germans know this very well because a lot of Germans maybe still grew up with Karl May novels, right? And the French Indian is very philosophical. I'm going to talk a bit about that. So the French connection to the native Brazilian, it's really a 5-century history. As I mentioned, some Tupi learned French, some married French people. And as I said, there are Tupi words in French. Many French people, both in Quebec and elsewhere in the Americas, became so-called white Indians, right? People who assimilated, liked the indigenous lifestyle. If you see Black Robed, there's a French character who is in that. And this white Indian character was a historical reality all over the Americas, right? And sometimes there would be people who were kidnapped by Indians, but would end up not wanting to go back to civilization. So even the American founding fathers who committed genocide would praise the happiness of Indians and say, in the French philosophy was also a leitmotif, that if they've known native civilization, they do not want to go back to so-called civilization. French literature, Rabelais, even Madame Bovary has an allusion to Brazilian Indians. The pharmacist Homais complains that French mothers are dressing their kids like botocudos, which was a group from Brazil, right? Do you know Red Brazil, Rouge Brazil? It was a TV series. It was a Franco-Brazilian production. So this whole period of the France Antarctique and the French colony in Brazil is sort of being rediscovered for art and literature in France. And it used to be I'd tell people in France about France Antarctique, what? We never had a colony in Brazil. What do you mean? And now it's very fashionable, and you even have TV series about it. So also, I mentioned that Kunhambebe was treated as a monarch, right, back in the 16th century. I wanted to, if we think of a continuum between Kunhambebe and current native representatives going to Europe, I think it's interesting to think about. So I just wanted to show Raoni, who's been famous since the 70s. There was a film that Marlon Brando narrated called Raoni, about Raoni already in the mid-70s, right? And the film won an Oscar. So he's a real diplomat, and I just want to show a scene where he talks about meeting with Chirac. He also met with Mitterrand in 1983 with Sting. I would love to find on YouTube that meeting, but I haven't found it. So anyway, the next should be, whoop, how tasty. We've talked so much about how tasty, let's skip how tasty. So I think people have already, Lucien Agib talked about it, right? So we should have the Raoni. So on YouTube, you can also see Raoni being honored by the French Assembly, the National Assembly, where we honor the presidents. So there's a tradition of French heads of state actually meeting with native Brazilians. And I'm saying this is really a 500-year tradition. I'm not saying it has immense political consequence. Also, Raoni, when Sarkozy was in Brazil, on the YouTube, you can see him denouncing Sarkozy, you know, with your companies, you're contaminating the Amazon, and so forth. So I want to talk a bit about the prominence of indigenous people in Western philosophy. So what is the most famous phrase from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan that everyone knows? Oliver? Say it again. Pardon me? Yeah, permanent war, war of each among each, a state of nature characterized by the life that is brutal, nasty, and short, right? This is in 1651. Do you remember who he gave as an example of the state of nature? It was the Indians, so-called, of New York State. He said, I've never met any of these people living in this horrible state, but they say there are native peoples in New York State who are barbarous and live in a constant state of war. In fact, these groups had, you know, centuries of tradition of confederacies, of peace, quasi-democratic elders, a lot of power for women, and that's a bit what Engels wrote about, right, in the idea of primitive socialism. So even in somebody like Hobbes, you get a reference to this. So also I want to point out that you know, you have Eduardo Viveros de Castro with talking about the indigenous people and the philosophy of indigenous people. And as we know, he's very Deleuzian. You also now have Deleuzian native scholars. There's a woman named Jody Bird who wrote a book called Transit of Empire. She's Choctaw native. She's also part of the queer indigeneity movement, and she's completely sophisticated, knows Deleuzian language. She likes him, thinks he's progressive, but then when it comes to an indigenous perspective, she talks about the limits of a concept like nomadism or becoming Indian, right? But she speaks as an equal to him, and without hostility. It's not an ethnic, you're not an Indian, you can't speak about it. But I think that's what, you know, we have the Indio Tecnizado. Here you have the high-tech theoretical indigenous person, so. So, yeah, I think one of the most radical features of Oswald's manifesto is this single sentence, which is packed with centuries of history, where he says, filiation, the contact with Caraíba, Brazil, right? The contact with indigenous people. The place where Villegagnon landed. Villegagnon was the head of France Antarctique, right? So he's talking about the French colony from 1555 to 1560. The natural man, Rousseau. And remember in the Rouen festival, they talk about so natural, I'm natural. So Rousseau had the theory of the natural person who was not corrupted by civilization. And then he says from the French Revolution to Romanticism, to the Bolshevik Revolution, to the Surrealist Revolution, to Kaiserling's technicized barbarian, o Indio Tecnizado. So this sentence, to me, is 5 centuries of philosophy summed up with the idea that the native people contributed to a revolution, which is the French Revolution, but offer a revolution that goes beyond the French Revolution. Remember he said, Without the Indian, you would never have the French Revolution with its pathetic rights of man. Now, why do you think he would say pathetic rights of man? To me, it's the idea of a Bill of Rights is very individual. It's my right to property, right? It's not gregarious. It's not communal. So I'm imagining that's what's behind his saying you're pathetic. Of course, now we're fighting for those pathetic rights. They're very important. So, so let's go to the next. Yeah, this, does anyone know this book? This is by Afonso Arinos de Melo Franco, and it's called The Brazilian Indian and the French Revolution. Now that sounds like an absurd concept, right? But he says, this is a book from 1937, he's quite conservative. It's the same Arinos from the Law Against Discrimination. But he gives an intellectual history basically saying Jean Delery talked about the Indians. Montaigne wrote Des Cannibales with cultural relativism. Rousseau politicized Montaigne, and you get the French Revolution, right? But he doesn't like the French Revolution, and he doesn't like Indians, and he hates socialism, right? But what's interesting is both Oswald and this conservative are saying the same thing, that somehow the idea of freedom and equality led us to the French Revolution. So another person who has the same discourse is Lévi-Strauss. And as we know, he was in Brazil from 35 to 39 and wrote Triste Tropique. And he had a similar lineage, and he loved Jean Delery. The only book he took to Brazil was Jean Delery's Story of a Trip to Brazil, right? Now, a friend of mine named Marcello Fiorini, if anyone knows him, lived with the Nabi, you know him? Yeah. Yeah, he lived with the Nabiquara for many years, Marcello. And Lévi-Strauss also studied the Nabiquara. So when Marcello was in Paris, he contacted Lévi-Strauss, who was then something like 99, shortly before his death. So Marcello was the last person to interview Lévi-Strauss for a film. And he made this feature film called Lévi-Strauss auprès de l'Amazonie. And I'll just show the beginning where you see Lévi-Strauss speaking. But what's interesting to me is Lévi-Strauss had a similar narrative. Here's from Triste Tropique. It was the accounts of travelers like Jean Delery that began the anthropological awareness of modern times. It was their unintentional influence which set the political and moral philosophy of the Renaissance on the road that was to lead to the French Revolution. So here's the conservative, Oswald and Lévi-Strauss saying something very similar, and the Samba school saying they gave the tone of freedom to Rouen. So let's just see the beginning of Marcello. He died, and there was a memorial for him at the Quai Branly where Marcello and others would read passages from Lévi-Strauss's book. And Marcello went back to the Nabiquara and the other groups and asked them, he showed photos of Lévi-Strauss and asked them if they remembered Lévi-Strauss. And they said, yeah, he's very tall. We called him Massimo Levi. So this technique in documentaries of using a photo, Coutinho does this too, right, to trigger memories and conversation. Okay, what's next? Pierre Closter obviously is part of this whole sequence of thinkers. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is a Caetano song, Magnetin. Okay, this is my first and only mashup, but there's a book called Manhattan, which is digital images of Manhattan before the Europeans arrived, right? And when I've taught this poem, both in Brazil and the US, and people do not recognize necessarily that it's Manhattan, right? And Caetano said he saw the word Manhattan, he thought in Portuguese, NH is manhã, right, like morning. So for him, it was like a Tupi word. So he does this brilliant thing. He uses the word cunha, which is Tupi for young woman. In Macunaíma, you constantly hear cunha. He puts her in a canoe in the Hudson River, which goes north to south. So he mentions north to south. And then he talks about the lady with a torch in her hand, which is obviously the Statue of Liberty. And then there's the whirlpool of money that's circulating around the world, which is obviously Wall Street. And he was referencing Sozanderagi, who was an exiled poet in Manhattan as well, who wrote about Indians. And he had a canto, which was the Inferno of Wall Street, right? So somehow Caetano has fused, and the lyric you hear, they're singing the sweet name of the cunha. he fuses the idea of liberty, the Statue of Liberty, and a native Brazilian woman and a native American, North American indigenous person before the conquest. So I think that's absolutely incredible kind of trans-historical fusion that he's making with this lyric. Also, you always know what Caetano was reading from his lyrics, right? So he was obviously reading Thomas Hobbes because there's a line, Levi, Leviathan. Now, tell me, in Brazil, does anyone, people say baleia for a whale, but does anyone use Leviathan in everyday discourse? So it can only be Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, right? But what I find brilliant is, you know, Hobbes' Leviathan is the heavy monarch which creates awe in people, the sovereign. But this is a light Leviathan. So he's writing this poem in the heyday of globalization. So now you have electronic transfers, liquidity. So it's very light. It looks light. It's actually very oppressive, but it looks very rapid and smooth. So that's Manhattan. So I wanted to get to the two other connections. There's an indigenous symbol on the dollar. Does anyone know what it is? There's an eagle, it's not very easy to see, but who has a quiver of arrows with 13 arrows. And they got that symbol from the Iroquois, because the Iroquois had a confederacy of 6 nations, and they said, we're different arrows, but we're in the same recipiency, right? So there's a lot of work by Native American writers. You know, when I say Native American, I mean Indian, right? Who talk about the presence of the indigenous ideas that influenced the founding fathers. It didn't help them much because they were destroyed, but there's a whole, and there's a bond between the French philosophers who were friends of the American founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin embraced Voltaire in Paris. So that was a leitmotif in the French philosophe, but also in the American founding fathers, right, of this idea of the Indian as exemplar of freedom. So next.
Adalbert Heide,
okay,
aufgewachsen in einem kleinen Dorf.
Yeah, here we get to the German connection. I think you were planning to show this film, but you couldn't, or O Mestre o Divino. And I want to talk about media indígena, because you have a huge movement in Brazil of Indians, so-called, making films. Vincent Carelli, Video in the Villages, has formed many filmmakers. So this film is called O Mestre o Divino. Anybody seen it? Anyway, it's from 2015, and it's about a German Salesian monk named Adalbert Heide and a Angewandte filmmaker named Divino. And you'll see in the film, Divino is very witty. He's Angewandte. I've met him in Brazil. I've met him in New York. Whenever he sees me, he knows he's going to irritate me, and he says, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he knows I hate Arnold Schwarzenegger. So anyway, that's his kind of spirit. So the title invokes the master is the priest, and Divino is literally, that's his name, Divino. And he's a Angewandte who was an altar boy and then became a filmmaker, right? So this is this idea of the white Indian, right? But the German take based on Karl May novels and the whole romance of the Indian. So that's a new take on Deleuze, you know, becoming Indian, right? So he's a German who loved Indians. Usually when Germans thought of the Indian, it was North American, right? The Sioux and the Cheyenne and so forth, Apache. So are people still reading Karl May novels in school? Yeah, okay. And he was so open to interpretation, right? So the left would like him, Hitler liked him, Albert Schweitzer liked him, so very hermeneutically open, right? But not more of a romantic figure. So it's interesting, in the film, the priest actually calls Divino Winnetou, you know, hey Winnetou, right? And for some reason, I don't know why, with my son also we'll play, if we're in the forest, I'll say, Winnetou, yes, Shatterhand, right? And you have this very much in the European novel, this kind of homoerotic romance between men. You have it in Robinson Crusoe, right? If you read Robinson Crusoe, women don't exist in that novel. He gets married and he kills off his wife in a sentence. You know, I married and it was good and she gave me 3 sons and she died, right? You never know her name. when he meets Friday, describes him handsome, long hair, and goes out of his way to say he's not black, right? He had fine, long hair. He had a fine nose, not a wide nose. So he's saying, don't think of slavery, right? Think of this. It's an Indian. It's a good Indian, right? So I think Shatterhand and Winnetou have a bit of this. Tell me if I'm wrong, but there's this kind of homoerotic, biracial buddy film kind of thing. So this is Divino, and he talks about helping Haida project these German Indian films for Xavante audiences. So 2 points. If you think of Oído Tecnizado, there's a joke in the film that the Indian is much more high-tech than the priest. So he's always needling him, you know, your computer is so slow, you don't have Final Cut Pro, this is terrible, right? So there's constant battle. But there's also a battle of aesthetics, because as you see, Haida's approach is very pastoral, it's very idealized, and it's his image of the wonderful Indian community, and he eliminates any signs of tension. Meanwhile, Divino does the opposite. He's not concerned if there's a positive image. He shows tension, he shows people get drunk, he shows conflict. So there's a battle of aesthetics between this idealization and then this more realistic Xavante portrayal. Another thing, you know, the book by Eduardo Viveros de Castro, Inconstância da Alma Selvagem, right? You see that in the film because he explains that, well, we sort of converted to Christianity, but we didn't really mean it because the Salesians helped us in a bad moment, but, you know, that's not really what we think. And when he represents the religion, they say, well, no, it's not really like that. He doesn't really understand it, et cetera. So you have the religious tension, but always very gentle. It's not aggressive. So I wanted to show the climactic scene, which is astonishing. So she's inviting Indians to play at being Indians, and you see they're very uncomfortable. It's as if she's better at being Indian than the Indians, and this is often in films like Avatar or Dance with Wolves. The white guy's better at being Indian than the Indians themselves, right? So quite astonishing. So Diego, who is now a friend of Divino, is shocked to see that he saw this film, sang along with it, and then finally sees it in a completely different context. Do we have time for one song by Caetano, which fits in? Yeah? Okay, this is, I thought this was appropriate, Caetano's song, O Índio, which is from, I think, mid-70s, right? And in a way, it was a prophetic song because it talks again about the high-tech Indian, right? So the Indian arrives in kind of a spaceship, and encounters of a third kind had been very popular, so there's almost this image of science fiction, and he presents a very transnational figure of an Indian. So let's hear O Índio.